Any novice in the ways of the warfighter should be intimately acquainted with the concept of defense in depth, alternatively known as an elastic defense, an onion or tree ring defense, concentric defense, a castle defense, a deep defense, or hippity-hoppity, get off my property. Yes, I stole that joke from Tex Talks Battletech. I make no apologies. Go watch his videos, they're awesome and are a considerable source of inspiration for my own, at least as far as mechs are concerned. And speaking of my own content, I don't know how I spent 8+ minutes talking about armor without bringing up composite plates. Well, actually, I do know, and while I'd like to tell you, it was that I was saving it for this entry on account of its poetic alignment with the concept of layered defense, it would be a bold-faced lie. But my early onset of dementia notwithstanding, composite armor is exactly what the name implies. Armor composed of layered materials, including metals, ceramics, plastics, and even air, with the goal being to grant a single plate greater stopping power, while also being lighter and or less voluminous than a full plate equivalent of any constituent element. And much like reactive armor, its main purpose is to defeat heat or high-explosive anti-tank munitions. However, while the latter is susceptible to successive shots in the same location, composite armor can, at least in theory, sustain multiple hits from at or below its rating before being fully compromised, though I do need to stress the theoretically part of that last sentence. But, just like reactive armor, composite armor and all forms of passive defense are primarily meant to be a final bulwark, a last line of defense against the enemy's one lucky shot that managed to breach the castle's outer defenses. So, what are these outer defenses? Well, as I've said repeatedly up to this point, it depends on what you're expecting to defend against. In my view, given what I've asserted a mech's design and primary purpose to be, essentially either a land-based battlecruiser or destroyer, the primary matchups of a dedicated combat mech would be heavy infantry and IFVs. Also known as an MICV for Mechanized Infantry Combat Vehicle, an IFV serves functionally the same role as horse cavalry and chariots did back in the days of swords and arrows. In essence, its job is to take a unit of infantry, typically a single squad, into the thick of a combat zone and shield them from the sorts of threats that they would struggle to handle alone. Things like heavy machine guns, mortars, or in our case, a mech, potentially wielding the same or greater, which we'll go into more next time. For this purpose, IFVs are set apart from other AFVs, armored fighting vehicles, by their being armed with a large cannon, typically at least 20mm. Having higher firepower than APCs while being cheaper and easier to maintain than tanks, I personally see IFVs as a mech's chief competitor mainly because they would fill such similar roles. However, the issue for mechs is that, like the IFV, being so lightly armored, and they would likely be even more so due to the reduced load-bearing capacity and increased ground pressure of legs compared to wheels and tracks as we've previously established, means they wouldn't be able to rely on it for anything greater than small arms protection, meaning that, like the IFV, anything at or above its own weight class would most probably be more than capable of punching its ticket. But the good news is that, unlike the IFV, a metal tyrannosaur would have the flexibility to not be around the same area long enough for such big problems to come looking for it, especially in dense or on uneven terrain, at least in theory. Which brings me to the second major op for a mech, heavy infantry, specifically the sort who pack portable anti-tank munitions, a group of scouts armed with mortars, grenade launchers, rockets, heavy machine guns, and or explosives can just as easily be the death of an unwary mech pilot as can a rolling metal death crate, and they have the advantage of being smaller and more easily concealable targets. So how does a mech deal with such issues, you may ask? Well, for a start, the greatest method of all to not getting forcibly evicted from the universe is to not get hit in the first place, and the easiest way to do that is to not let the enemy know you're there, which while being considerably easier said than done, especially when you're the bigger target, given a suite of optic, sonic, thermal, and EM signal detectors, a modern mech warrior should have no trouble spotting an enemy at near to medium range. And having the capacity to carry much bigger and heavier guns than the infantry means that the infantry have far more to worry about once their element of surprise has either been spent or stolen. And here's where we come to what I believe is the crux of the issue, the main event, as it were. For in modern wars, as evidenced by the events unfolding over in Ukraine, the main element at charge is not who has superior range, the better gear or training or weapons, nor even about who can stack DPS the fastest. No. Against a peer or near-peer adversary, the keystone factor is what the U.S. military refers to as displacement time. That is, the time it takes for a unit, usually referring to mobile artillery, to set up, complete their task, and move out before the enemy can locate and strike their position. In short, this New Age's war meta, even against major powers, looks poised to resemble more a mass-scale guerrilla-style grind-fest as opposed to the unified combined arms offensives of the early and mid-20th century or the systematic command and control style of conquest seen in the twilight of the 20th and into the youngest decades of the 21st. Sun Tzu said, "All war is deception," and Napoleon Bonaparte said, "God fights on the side with the best artillery." I could very easily see pairs or even small packs of small and medium-sized mechs stalking in hard-to-reach areas, working almost exactly like sniper teams, manned machine gun and mortar crews, with one mech hefting the gun, the other tagging along with spare ammo and barrels, and possibly a third armed with electronic surveillance and interference equipment, as well as a drone package for target spotting. And having more flexibility, in every sense, than even most wheeled UTVs, and coming with the intrinsic benefit of being both auto-loading and auto-servicing, the displacement time for an HK mech artillery squad would, I think, be on par with a regular infantryman performing regular maneuvers with his service rifle. Simply crouch down, load, aim, shoot, stand up, and move on, all inside a similar span as it took me to read this sentence. Now, several people have made note of the added efficacy of shields for mechs on account of their possessing humanoid limbs and hands, and I'm inclined to agree. Like I said at the start of the last video, a shield's main advantage is that its defensive area is more concentrated and so can be built to withstand substantially greater punishment than armor, which has its defensive coverage spread out more broadly. It doesn't require exorbitant imaginative resources to think how a large armored wall that can be easily deployed, employed, and disposed of at a moment per a pilot's discretion would be a useful asset when maneuverability and stealth options are most limited, such as in the dense CQB confines of a city or suburban buildingscape. So, to sum up, as many of you adroitly mentioned in the comments section of last time, the adequacy of any defense is entirely dependent on what sorts of threats they're intended to stop. Like I've said before, there is no such thing as being 100% proof from anything. The nearest you can get is a wall of layered redundancies, an obscuring miasma to mask your position and movement, smoke, electronic spoofers, jammers, EMPs, etc., backed up by an array of semi-autonomous anti-missile, anti-air, and/or anti-personnel guns, whichever's most applicable, and then coated in a composite shell to, if not wholly stop, at least mostly blunt the shock of any piece of ordnance crafty or lucky enough to slip through the outer filters. But, as always, this is all just my opinion. As I've said many times and will continue to say so long as it remains so, I'm no expert, I'm no soldier, I'm just a guy with eclectic interests and a habit of jumping down rabbit holes with a blindfold on. So if that's your idea of fun too, leave a like and subscribe. And if you want to add some extra wind to my sails, then consider also tossing a coin or two into my hat or book a ride on my ship, and together we'll see what strange shores lay beyond our mortal horizon. Until then, stay safe, stay sane, and stay inventive. Peace.